Good afternoon. I'm Richard Stevenson. I'm going to be running this webinar this afternoon for BCAW. I'm just going to hold for a short while before we kick off, just to let a few people join us. We're at 13:59, so we're just waiting for the clock to click over. I think listening to the reports back from BCI over the BCAW week so far, it's been pretty well attended and some great stats. So a lot of work's gone into that, and it's a great way of raising awareness of business continuity. So we've clicked over the 2 o'clock marker, and so I'm going to kick off. And so the subject of this talk is that communication plan. The communication plan needs communication technology to deliver resilience. So I'm particularly going to be talking about the complexity of the plan and why technology is needed to deliver the resilience. And resilience is, of course, the theme of the week that we've got with BCAW. So what I'll cover today is look at a fairly high level thing, what has to happen in managing an incident and why the speed of communications is so essential in today's world. I'll look particularly at cyber attacks and terror, terrorist attacks, the frequency and the financial cost of these, and why it's so important that we mitigate these and how we do that. And look at some interesting case studies, particularly from cyber attacks. And then I'll take you through our approach to how we think incident communication should be handled. And I'll talk about the app, because part of this is all about how you'll use app technology to manage incidents better. So this is a simple diagram, but it's designed to be high level, to look at the 3 things that you could put into boxes. There's many ways of expressing this, but first is the top of the list. There is the response to an incident. So this is the immediate thing. The incident's happened. How do we respond to that incident? And over here we've got the resolution. How are we going to resolve it? And that's a lot of the focus of what's involved. And over here is then what a box called resilience. And this is resilience as a theme of this week. And the thinking of this is that once the incident is closed, then there's a lot of learnings to be done. The learnings from that incident can build greater resilience. So the next time that in fact we get a need for a response, we are much better prepared. So that's the sort of 3 R's, the circle that we look at. Now, there are 2 things you need to do in a crisis. The left-hand side over here is to fix the problem. And that's what most people would say. We need to get this problem sorted in the fastest possible way and get back to normal. That's business continuity. But over here, on the other side here, we've got keeping the stakeholders informed. And doing that is actually a very complicated thing, because really the focus is saying, what is happening? What do I need to do to fix it? But we've got a bunch of stakeholders. That means shareholders, that means staff, that means stakeholders that are involved in saying maybe trustees and other people that are interested, suppliers, customers. All of these people will want to be informed of what's happening. And it's very difficult to do both. So successful crisis communications requires you to do both. So let's look at the response communication side. So that is the way we're going to alert people. So we have to have the ability to alert and advise. But deciding on what we are going to say requires extremely fast approval. Now, the first message that you send out could be, there has been an incident, we will keep you informed. But very quickly after that, all you've done is actually really alerted people's curiosity, and they want to know more. So you cannot leave a big interval between that. So you need to get very fast approval and consensus on what is the message. And that message has to be one that you know you can consistently use going forward. So there's no point in putting a detailed message out if it's wrong. So what you need to have is consensus within the organization, and that will require a multi-disciplined team of different levels to say, this is how we should be communicating. You haven't got a lot of time, and therefore those people need to be consulted and agreed. You have to have consistent messaging, and you have to tailor the message to the audience. And that is simply that there may be some very detailed information and instructions that are needed for a more technical part of the organization, and then a broader message which is less detailed for other members of the company or the organization, or even external interested parties. And you have to not just push this out and then say, right, let's turn around and fix the problem. Right? We've now whetted people's appetite for this. We've now told them that there's something going wrong. So we cannot leave that void, because in the void, rumor and conjecture will percolate. And over the other side here is that what we need to do to resolve the problem is, in fact, have very quick assessment of the situation. And that means getting data back, getting information back from where this incident has actually happened, who's responsible, and so that from whoever's controlling incident to understand what the reaction needs to be. And to do that, you need to actually make sure you can notify and harness the key people that you need to fix this particular problem. And you have to agree very quickly a resolution plan, or as quick as you can, because some incidents are very complex. How are you going to resolve this? Get buy-in from everybody that is in the right levels of authority or right levels of technical knowledge to say this is the right way to do it. And of course, then you have to execute on that plan. All the meantime, keeping people informed. So let's look at the need for speed. So there's many cases where people have tried to fix a problem without communicating. Now, in today's world, that is an extremely risky strategy. Social media, of course, it's fast and it's sharp. And we now have little time to wait on legal advice. Now, it used to be the case that, once we discovered something, we brought all the experts together, our crisis PR people, our legal experts, everybody, and different directors that we found in different parts of the world, and decided how we were going to respond. If we take days to do this, then social media is really writing the script, and so fast and sharp. So we have little time to wait for this. We have to respond quickly. And if we think we can keep an incident buried, we have to then think again. The working assumption should be it will leak. And that is a negative issue if, in fact, they're finding it from a non-official source or trusted source. The other reason why we've got to be fast is that we've got a very much more interlinked world. Our supply chains and our customers are spread over the world, and there is much more collateral impact. So we've moved a lot, many businesses and many organizations have moved to outsource so many of their services. And therefore, this is no longer a matter within the walls of the corporation. This isn't something where there's huge collateral impact. And therefore, it's not a matter of just communicating inside, it's a matter of communicating outside. And we may find that, for example, part of our services are coming from a data center sitting in the United States somewhere, and they might have just had some sort of Iranian cyber attack based upon their displeasure at the latest US policy, and that could have a major element and effect on the operations of a corporation sitting in the UK or in Sweden or any other part of the world. So the world is much more interlinked. Now, stakeholders, in this world of social media, 24-hour news, stakeholders' expectation is to be informed. That's a real problem for companies or organizations, because we are not used to that, meeting that expectations. Even the news industry took a long time to get used to the rolling news program. But this is something where the expectation is to have information. And particularly if you are a corporation that has a public face or dealing with a public, or ones that's a good brand name, is the trolls and the fake news creators will go into action. Now, those trolls could be people in bedsits, or it could be fancy bears in Russia. Whatever it is, it's the fake news creators will go into action, and very quickly indeed. And they'll be quicker in many cases than companies. And remember that untruths make extremely good viral stories, and real correct truths take a long time to actually get round. Sort of false stories go much better around the world, and so we have to be very cognizant of that. And the final point on this slide, I'd say that there is a sort of, certainly in the UK, there is, and other countries in the world, there's an understanding that it is not just a matter of bad luck when incidents happens, that we have to say to people why we didn't look after them, why we didn't inform them, because this was just an unexpected event. We know these attacks are happening. We know cyber attacks will happen. We know terrorism on the rise. And therefore, we have an increased importance for delivering a duty of care to staff. And that means keeping them informed in an incident. So the toothpaste in the tube syndrome. And if you don't react quickly, the rumor and the false stories are out of the toothpaste tube, you try getting it back in. And the other point about speed and the importance of it is staff are now all publishers. You know, these amazing bits of technology on Facebook and Twitter, etc., and social media have actually now turned most of the public into publishers. And in the absence of information from a trusted source, which will be generally the company or corporation they're working for, then they will find other ways to fill the vacuum, and they will hook on to stories that in fact are coming from the Twitter sphere or from other stories out there. So you remember that they will then retweet, these stories, and it will have momentum, which is certainly what you don't want when it's in fact the wrong information. So you need to keep them informed, and this is important in terms of our view on crisis communications now, or incident communications. It's not a matter of dealing with just a core team that's going to fix things. I think with this reality now that everybody's publishers, we need to make sure that our communication systems covers all of the people in your organization. And that can be turned to big advantage, of course, because as they are all publishers, and as you are providing them with quality information and updating them on a regular basis, then in fact, that's the thing that they are tweeting. That is the thing that they're talking to people down the pub about. And therefore, you have now got a whole series of broadcasters who are actually able to counter the fake news that is bound to be happening. And what else has changed in incident response? Well, the simple word is immediacy. We just are having to deal with things where we had no warnings. And this is driven by the rise of professional cyber attacks, and we'll look at that in a minute. But the cyber and the software that's behind these hacking attacks is now available just like buying something from Bazaar. The City of London Police told me the other day that they reckon there was about 350 of these types of products that you can buy on the dark web. Anybody could buy these for the right sort of bitcoins, and this is just acting like a normal commercial transaction. And we're seeing, therefore, the industrialization of malware, industrialization of things. And Bitcoin is something which is really behind the capability of selling it without detection. And the dark web adds into that. So there are channels there where lots of people can get hold of very sophisticated malware. And the techniques they are doing are very much about artificial intelligence and machine learning. These are the tools that are being used there. So we're not talking about cyber attacks coming from, misguided individuals now. This is an industry, and we have to recognize that. Now, the immediacy of that is that this is done so professionally that you can only discover it at the last minute. And we're seeing state-sponsored danger to infrastructure. I talked about, Iran's capability, but also we've seen what Russia's capability is. And so we can expect things like wide area power disruption. So if you have data centers that are assuming that everything's going to run well, their battery systems are incredibly well maintained, their diesel generators are maintained, but you may find that the power infrastructure in those areas, maybe more than one data center, is interrupted for a prolonged period of time. So all of those systems have to actually work. But it's not just a matter of thinking about how well the UK on the power infrastructure is protected, because someone said to me the other day, we are well protected. I think that is it's dangerous to imagine that we probably are, but maybe we are. But certainly the supply chain may be sitting in countries that don't have the same protection. And of course, we've seen the growth of terrorism in European cities, 45 attacks since 2016. And a terrorism attack, you don't know when or where a terrorist is going to actually place a bomb or make an attack, but the impact is pretty huge. And it's not just the fact there is an attack. If you recall the incident at Oxford Circus not very long ago, where somebody knocked over a particular stand and there was a bit of an argument going on, and they assumed, somebody then said it was a bomb or a gun. That caused huge panic. Because we are aware and nervous about that, lots of disruption can occur. But certainly the security services in the UK are constantly trying to foil attacks, and I think there's been almost an attack a month foiled, and some of these things will get through. And we should be wrong to assume that these attacks are low-level attacks like we've been recently seeing with a truck or a thing. There's been some potentially very serious attacks, and the one in Barcelona, of course, where there was a lot of people tragically killed in Las Ramblas, but that was the truck. But the real intention was, in fact, those bombs that actually exploded when they were making them. And if that had happened, maybe hundreds, thousands of people would be killed. So terrorism is a threat. It's not going to go away, and it is immediate. And if you have an organization that is potentially close to a target, then that is something that can turn your business upside down. So what are the costs? Let's look at this. This is coming from a report that Allianz pushed out in 2017. And first of all, let's look at the main causes. And hackers attacks is the highest one that people is responsible for most of these things. And most of those, or a lot of these attacks, cyber attacks, involve data or security breach. And remember that we used to be, a lot of businesses and a lot of companies were about hoovering up data. Basically, we thought that more data we had, the better, and people were collecting data on people. Now, of course, GDPR is resetting that, and we're realizing that data that we shouldn't have is actually a potential liability. So there's a lot of cleansing going, and that's probably well overdue. But clearly, there's data sitting out there that is valuable. And then you have malware and viruses, which is the next main cause, and beneath that you have employee error. That is the employee sending information out or a big data file out to the wrong person. But we look at losses. Business interruption is the biggest loss. So Allianz will be paying out on losses, that business interruption for cyber attacks. But very close on the heel is the reputational loss. Now, you could argue that we all understand that we are vulnerable, and therefore there will be some sympathy if we're attacked. But that sympathy is lost if, in fact, clearly, and we'll see some examples in a minute, where the companies just have not done the right things to protect themselves. There will be no sympathy for that. So the reputational loss, particularly if you are an organization that handles consumer data or consumer information, could be very, very severe. And the next thing is liability claims that actually occur around a cyber attack. And then the lowest one is the reinstatement of data and restoration. But it's still a significant cost. So, and in many cases, in these types of attacks, data is permanently lost. And what makes cyber attacks more different and more complicated, and more immediate, is that breaches are often reported by outsiders. So your internal team, right, are not the people that discover the data breach. And by the Mandiant M Trends report in 2017, 53% of breaches were reported to the corporation by an external source. So one day you have a wonderful corporation, your share price is doing really well, there are no big issues, and the next day you're then informed that you've had a data breach. And so your world is turned upside down. So there is no warning for this, and we have to be prepared. Now, the other thing that we know is that breaches often occur over a long period of time. Very often the breach you don't notice, and the hacker is inside your system for a long time, looking at vulnerabilities and looking at ways in which they can exploit your system. So again, the Mandiant Trends information is that their estimate is that the average time that someone's in the system before you discover it is about 90 days. Just to give some balance there, Accenture has the figure 50 days. But whatever it is, people are inside your system exploiting your vulnerabilities when you don't know about it. And if we just have a quick look at the most attractive sectors for hackers, again, this is coming from the M Trends report, is that the financial sector, obviously the people think there are rich pickings there. You'd imagine that is the top of the list with retail and hospitality. Healthcare, high tech, and professional business services. It's fairly evenly spread, and we can say that as hacking tools get cheaper, industrialization increases, then in fact even the SMEs will find that they will get hacked because the cost of actually hacking is actually lower. At the moment, a lot of the targets are ones where there are supposed to be big prizes, but that's going to become less of an issue. We're going to find it widen. So we have a problem of protecting not only the very big businesses, but also the medium and smaller businesses, where an attack can be pretty well one that will put you out of business. I want to look at a few examples now, and this is one which is about your supply chain. Now, one of our partners, and someone I did a breakfast meeting with earlier this week, talks about doing a resilience scorecard, and particularly looking at the supply chain, so understanding, what are the vulnerabilities of your suppliers. And if we look at this story about TV5 in France, I mean, TV5 Monde was about to go and launch their satellite service. This is their big day. Everything was lining up for that, for their launch of their satellite channel. And this was on the 25th of January 2015. Now, the attackers were hidden for months, as per the slide I was talking about, and they spent a lot of time identifying weaknesses. They identified 7 weaknesses. And they finally used 2 external suppliers. One was a refrigerating contractor from Italy, and the other one was a remote camera supplier from Holland. And so on that particular day, just when they were launching, the attack happened. Now, the attack was nicely masked as being supposedly an ISIS attack, but actually it turned out to be a Russian, a Fancy Bears one from Russia. But the thing was so effective because they had so much time to plan for it. All of their systems were infected, and the only way they could actually communicate was via fax machines. And this actually went on for a long, long time. So it was months before they could reconnect to the internet because they were trying to disinfect their whole systems. And it cost them $4.5 million in the first year, followed by a recurring cost of $2.7 million a year for new protection. But they also had to change their whole operating procedures. This was a TV station. They're used to getting sort of clips in from different people who are providing news feeds. All of that had to change. They had to slow down and accept that the world was different. Now, Equifax was a disaster. Let's think about that. The size of this. This was pretty well half the entire United States population. 145 million people's data was breached. But they think that this was breached. Just look at the timeline. This was breached on May the 16th, and they now actually believe it's earlier. But it was identified on July the 29th when they discovered it. A few days later, the CFO sold 30% of the shares in Equifax. Well, you can draw your own conclusions from that, but clearly it would be odd if those two events did not link. But it wasn't until September the 5th that they decided to announce this. And so they left all that time, and all those people's data were being compromised, including social security numbers and lots of very, very sensitive information, which would allow people to do sort of complete identity fraud. And they then set it up and announced it after the close. So 41 days later, all right, this was actually announced. And it was announced, incidentally, on Twitter. And what it said, we recently discovered a cybersecurity incident involving consumer information. Once discovered, we acted immediately to stop the intrusion. So you can say, well, there's a number of active words there. Say we recently discovered. Is recent a week or a month or 3 months or 4 months? So, and they've been massively criticized, not only for being complacent about how they looked after the customer data, but also how they've been very slow to communicate. Now, as you all know, as most of you on the calls know, under GDPR, this just will not be possible. And GDPR in the 72-hour window is going to put a lot of pressure on organizations to actually communicate fast. And whether they can do that it remains to be seen. But that's the objective, and that's what we have to try and do. Talking about reputational cost, that was the other thing on the Allianz list, was if we take Fonseca, the international law firm that looked after the affairs of Russian oligarchs, perfectly respectable international companies, and also some very scurrilous individuals as well. But whatever it is, they actually worked on their reputation to say, your information will be safe with us. Now, they lost 2.6 terabytes. That's 11.6 million documents. And access was probably over a couple of years. They did not know about this. But from March 2016 to 2018, it took 2 years from them to go from an internationally famous law firm to one that was closing its doors. It just never recovered from the loss of confidence. And that's what reputational costs can do to a business that relies upon its integrity to be successful. But the lessons are that we are all at risk. Last June, there was an attack, and you probably remember it. It was the attack that actually started off in Ukraine, and the attack entered through DLA Piper's Ukrainian office and infected the whole of DLA Piper. And as Larry Poneman, who specializes in this area, was saying, that DLA Piper is probably an excellent firm, and therefore it could happen to anybody. So it took, the only way that they could communicate to the staff when this happened was to putting this notice board up here, which to tell people not to switch on their computers, etc. And they took 1 day to restore the phones, 6 days to restore the emails, and they had an unspecified number of file and data storage problems that, and many of these things I don't think were restored. But the issue was they couldn't speak to their clients, they couldn't speak to their customers because they were complete without communications. And that's an issue where, as a good organization like DLA Piper was hit, that means that we're all vulnerable. So Sentinel was essentially created to solve some of these incident handling problems. And I'm just going to set out some of our principal objectives for when we design the product. So it had to have the ability to immediately respond, immediately communicate. It had to have an independent channel. That means no umbilical cords to the organization. So if there was any linkage that linked it to the servers of the corporation, where the servers of the corporation failed, and it relied upon that connection to operate, then it wouldn't be independent. So this had to be entirely independent communication system ready to go. And the communication tools had to be targeted. I spoke beforehand about the need for different messages or different details of those messages to go to different groups. So it's not sufficient to have a mass alert going out to everybody. We had to make sure that different groups could have different communications. And we had to have a system where the user interface and the way in which information was flowing was sufficiently good to get the incident controllers to be able to think clearly and to be analyzing the feedback in a very user-friendly way. So otherwise, in these incidents, the issues are people get overwhelmed very considerably. And in designing Sentinel, which goes back 3 years now, is that we spent a lot of time talking with people that had suffered incidents, and from that, really the way this architecture was developed was coming from what people's real life experience was, and thinking clearly was one of those issues. And this problem of really about incidents, particularly to do with crisis and incidents, is that they're not happening every day. They're not part of our daily rhythm that we go through life. And so when something happens, suddenly we have to remember our training. Now, the Army, of course, deals with this, because they just train and train and train and train, and they drum it in. But across a corporation, we can't train in the same intensity as we would do in military. But clearly, that's why the military do it, so that you then kick in when something happens and remember your training. So this problem of memory fade, we do some instant training, people forget. But when you have a crisis, you have to know what to do and remember. So this was a classical problem that people had. We needed to solve that. And we had to make plans and instructions immediately available, but also we had to have a system that would allow people to be flexible, to be able to adapt, because we knew one certainty in life is whatever's just happened is not actually in the playbook that you've rehearsed. So you have to have the ability to modify and adapt. Plans are essential, they are a stake in the ground, but you need to be able to say, how do we actually adapt to deal with this particular crisis? So those were our objectives. Let's explore some of these things. The immediacy and independence. So first of all, we wanted to get away from the need to run an incident from a control room. One of the things we were told that very often it was difficult to get there. If you want true resilience, you needed to have a backup control center. A lot of companies didn't have one, and we needed to basically say that we can run an incident from any location. And in fact, you can run it from a tablet or a laptop or even a phone if necessary. Whoever's controlling could do that. You needed to be able to go straight into immediate messaging. You needed to have the independent channels we talked about. You needed to have multiple channels. So it wasn't sufficient for us to say, well, let's just communicate by SMS to people. We needed to have SMS. We needed to have in-app messaging. So in-app messaging, we needed to have email as a parallel tool as well, secondary backup email. We needed to have voice. And so all of these things, not just one channel, we need to have multiple channels to make sure that if we were in an emergency trying to communicate, we knew that that message was going to get through by one or all of those channels. But we also needed to deal with this feedback issue. And the feedback issue is that if, for example, you wanted to send out an email to 350 people and saying, tell me your status or are you safe? You would get 350 emails coming back, or maybe not 350, but you will get emails coming back in large quantities, which will all need to be read, interpreted, and that, in fact, is a loss of time. So we felt that was not the right way to do things. So we introduced a feature where you could poll people and get yes/no feedback. So you're asking these binary questions, which will give you feedback that you can use in a graphical interface. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So the tunnel vision that happens in a crisis, and I was speaking to someone the other day who had one of their crisis team caught up in these terrible dust storms in India, and the team that was involved in how to handle that really got overwhelmed by the nature of the crisis. And that is a common thing. So we've got to stop this problem of being swamped and getting diverted when in fact there's a very serious issue that has to be resolved very, very quickly indeed. And we had no preparation for this. This has just happened. So it can be avoided by, of course, training, and the quality of training is absolutely essential. It's better done when we've got more simulations and more training that is much more meaningful rather than sort of straightforward textbook training. But definitely training can help. But one of the things that happens in a crisis is that you need to say, who do I contact? And therefore, you have to have immediate access to the key contacts, not to have to search for the right person, not to look through your own directory for who is it the person that's in charge of this area. You have to have very, very clear interface to say, these are the people I need to tell about, or these are the people I need to consult. And you have to have immediate access to plans. So if you have a crisis, you say, this is this type of crisis, what is our plan for this? And it is not a matter of saying, where is the plan? It's in the safe, it's at home, it's sitting here. It's got to be immediate access, and that's what we intended to have in your hand to make sure that had access. And it helps if you, in a crisis, that you then have your action list. What is the thing I'm supposed to do? That stops people drifting and losing their focus. And the other part, which is often not the case, is you've got to have a very simple and clear user interfaces. And this is partly because if your people are picking up, could be an app, it could be a bit of software, etc., that they haven't used maybe for a little while because they haven't had a crisis, it's got to be so intuitive that they don't have to have the training. You simply follow that. So a lot of stopping people from panicking is thinking, well, how do I use this thing, is getting a very good user interface. An example of that would be, for example, this arrangement of getting a polling feedback that I talked about a little bit earlier, which is where you've got, you're asking a question. In this case, it's saying, are you safe? And so if I'm actually not interested in the Greens who are saying I'm safe in a certain circumstance, I'm interested in the red who say they're not safe. And I'm also interested in the orange to say these people haven't responded. And I've got various tools, which immediately means I can recontact these people who haven't responded until I can turn them into reds or greens. What that tends to do is that it gives you an immediate picture by asking questions that are, in fact, are getting this yes/no answers, and it can focus your resources on the exceptions and the non-responders. Now, in built-up areas of London or any major city, an evacuation of a building has a muster point or a place where people end up. Now, very often, this is not as well coordinated as you might imagine. That simple piece of green brass is, in fact, the muster point for the 5 or 6 buildings all around the center. So actually, people going out of buildings, in fact, is a dangerous issue, because we all know from at least 5 or 6 recent terrorist attacks, that is where, in fact, the secondary device is, or the shooter is. And so you set up the fire alarms and people go up there, and that is, in fact, a known problem that the Met Police and many other people are aware of, acutely aware of this issue. So a lot of people flee, a lot of people do it. And what we're saying, that it doesn't matter where you are, you can just check in from a Starbucks or whatever it is, and we know that you're safe, and we then, what we can do is then focus on the exceptions, not everybody. So if you had 300 people you're concerned about, and 280 of those people all go green, you're actually focusing on 20, not trying to figure out the 320. That means that the response you have is so much more efficient in terms of time. So let's talk about training and the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Now, some of you will know this, but it's a pretty interesting experiment that was done at the end of the 1890s by a psychologist and a behavioral scientist called Ebbinghaus. And he taught people up the learning curve, if you like, and then, in fact, measured how, by a series of tests, how fast they forgot that knowledge. And it's an astonishingly fast rate. And in this case, as time passed, roughly the average was within the first month, 90% of what has been learned had been actually lost. And he did further work on that. He then said, okay, so what can affect that? What makes it better? And that's something which he called the strength of memory. And this was about the stronger memories lasting longer than the weaker ones. So if you have a really engaging course in training that really is maybe like simulation and things like that, that's going to last longer than something that is in fact a rather dull bit of classroom teaching. But the impact on this is pretty profound. So I did that simple one just to give you a lead into this one, which looks a little bit more complicated, but this is in fact normal classroom learning on the green line. And as we pass this black line where things stop, you see the classroom learning drops off very much along that same curve we saw on the last slide. If you have space learning, that's more like coaching, a whole series of coaching points beforehand. Then when you stop that process, then in fact the space forgetting curve is in fact much more gentle. And the way that you can sort of stop that curve from falling down to these depths here is very much by reactivation and e-learning. So you're constantly going through the point of saying, I'm going to go back and learn these issues. Otherwise, you're going to end up here. Now, what does that matter for crisis and incident management and what people need to do? It wouldn't matter so much if it's about certain general techniques in a business that you might want to do, but this could be life-saving. And the only way you do that is to make sure that people are continually trained, just like I said, from the military, which is in fact very expensive and really not practical in a business when in fact you're planning for something which you don't know whether it's going to happen. So training people on what to do in a crisis when they have, maybe if they've only forgotten 50% on this particular curve, the 50% they've forgotten may be the critical thing they need to know in a crisis. So the only way you really do that for sure is making sure that they have got their reference manual in their hand of what they've got to do. And that means that you don't have to remember from your training, you don't have to remember exactly what you're supposed to do in the business continuity plan. But so the disaster recovery plans and the comms plans are there immediately to hand. And particularly when you have a failing network, because you need to be able to do this when the signal is lost. So these need to be downloaded in your device, and they need to be the latest version, not the old version. The big advantage of having this off email distribution is that it's not sitting on someone's email box where the latest plan is there. It's actually always updated. And in an app environment, what an app does really well is keep these sort of documents in a nice place, in a nice category where people can retrieve it and search across documents. So having those plans, even if you've lost your signal, you have no Wi-Fi, you have no 4G, you can actually see what there is there in the plans. And there's a crude document system is no good because, you know, these are sophisticated plans, sometimes confidential plans, particularly disaster recovery plans, which are largely IT things. They're very sensitive plans. So you need to make sure that those plans are only in the hands of the right people. So it's not sufficient to have documents out there unless you can know that they are given to individuals. Now, you can distribute documents by other systems like Dropbox and other elements. The difference is, in this environment, is that you are in control of who gets what. So it's more in the controlling area to see they're a member of this IT group, they see these documents, and it's more push than it is, in fact, pull from that point of view. So the groups are really important so they can see different groups. And this overcomes this idea that we've got to rely upon our training. And if we took the rest of the organization, things that are maybe less sophisticated than the full detailed plans are action lists and playbooks. One of them is what to do when the signal is lost. You know, you go and look at your app and say, this is what I'm supposed to do. You have the things, stay at your desk, go home, do things, you know, or contact these people when the signal comes on, whatever it is that you decide to do. And you can have action lists for each scenario. And there's no need for expensive company-wide training all the time because, in fact, people have these training documents in their on their devices. So the only really training we're talking about here is saying, you know, there's a crisis, check your app. And that's a much simpler message to put across. We've recently developed a product which is called Sentinel Apps, which is actually an entry-level element, which is just doing the simple things that we've just talked about, not with all the sophistication of the other elements that I have touched on so far. But you know, sometimes you just need a very simple thing to do, and this is where there's an app with a welcome screen and action cards and a directory. So all it does is say, these are the situations you have. This is, say, in a hotel, so there's a lockdown or there's firearms inside the hotel. I click on that, and up comes, this is a suspect package here, tells the person, I click on the card for more detailed information and what to do. Now, that is something you can do within seconds of something happening. And in there is also a directory which is updated from the center. So they don't have to worry about updating the contacts directory. That is updated for them. To access that, they have to use their Touch ID or Face ID or their PIN code, but then they can actually then immediately make contact by SMS or calling the duty manager or the person responsible on that things. And that's just a very simple way of building resilience into an organization. So flexibility is the really story behind the groups. So yes, you can set up your groups, and groups, by the way, can be by location, it can be by floor of a building. So facilities management issues where they can say, I want to communicate with everybody on the 4th floor or the 10th floor, or by particular companies. And it can be by seniority or by silver team, gold team groups, etc. But you can also form groups on the fly, because it may well be, in this particular case, you now have got certain people, you say, I need this team to solve the problem. You pull that group together and you then can give them access to documentation. You can then communicate with that group. So having the flexibility to form groups is really important. And the other really thing that we thought was really important to do was to be able to form hybrid groups. That means people inside your organization and outside. That may mean that, for example, senior management, directors plus your crisis PR team all working together. It may be internal IT working with an external IT supplier on things to solve the problem. And these are communication document groups. So building flexibility is a way of building resilience, and we're talking about mitigating a crisis by taking the right actions very early on in the process. So communication plans are effectively now much more complex. And this is just an example which to show you how many people we're having to talk to in different ways. And this here talks about the target, when, what, the frequency, the method. So if it was something like a knife attack or something, then the security team needs to be informed. It's the detail we need to know. If it's maybe emergency services, who are the emergency services? That's got to be immediate. The IT team, there's been some sort of breach, somebody wants to report it, it's an immediate thing. We've got staff, this is the general staff in the organization. We've got the directors, the chief executive, the chief finance officer, etc. When do we tell them, and what do we tell them, and how often do we keep them informed? And we have shareholders, you know, we've heard a rumor, we've been watching this on Twitter. What is it that is my shareholding at risk? I'm going to be nervous. I want to know what's going on. And so there is you've got to think about those. We've got key clients. The clients now are concerned. Has my data been breached? Is there some issue I should know about? Am I going to be able to be serviced by your company during this particular attack? And of course, social media. We have to, you know, whatever social media channels that the company or the organization is using has to make sure they're fired up and they're on their game and they're monitoring what is happening in the social space and responding to it. And of course, the press needs more of a briefing, a more considered approach. And the press, you know, used to think of corporations, dry corporations and things rather sort of slightly sterile places for stories. Now, these organizations have basically exploded into a whole bunch of individuals working for a corporation. You can see what happened on TSB, for example. You know, the stories that were being run in the newspaper after that outstanding debacle of TSB, which we still have difficulty getting our minds around how that level of incompetence actually was as allowed to play out. But nevertheless, the stories that were most interesting were the ones where people were trying to complete on their mortgage, their dream house that they couldn't do, and all these things. These are great stories for newspapers. And so, you know, the press needs to know that, you know, you're being highly professional about it. But, you know, the press are people that you have to speak to. And supply chain, we talked about that beforehand. This is sometimes extremely critical to make sure the supply chain know how to behave. There's been cases we've spoken to about where the infection of a restaurant chain could be traced back to supply chain very, very quickly. They're supplying multiple number of restaurants in the same area. How does that information get back to them to stop actually the supply, to mitigate the effect? Any sort of support services, and of course we have authorities, you know, with the data requirements under GDPR for reporting in 72 hours. And of course, probably should be way up the list is that if you're a larger corporation with a crisis PR team in tow, getting to that crisis PR team engaged in this event is so important early on. And obviously we saw with United Airlines how that incompetence there, where the chief executive decided to castigate the poor chap who was being dragged down the aisle by the United Airlines staff. Clearly the crisis PR team did not get to him early enough, and that's why speed, as we were talking about beforehand, is so critical. Now, in our architecture, we're not about creating a series of peer-to-peer discussions. So we're not trying to replicate a Yammer or a Jive or some of these other bits of software that allows people to set up conversations amongst themselves. This is about command and control with feedback coming back into your center so you can make things. And all crises need to be dealt with that command and control philosophy. And teams need to be multidisciplinary. So all of these issues that affect the corporation are business issues and not just IT issues. So why use smartphones? Well, we all have them. I think the figures are now well into the 90s in the UK. So and certainly amongst business users, most people have smartphones. And that, of course, can mean that they can get much richer information. So this is our parallel form of communication through to people on smartphones, and we should use it. So the app advantage in instant communications is controlled and practiced environment. It's an independent comms channel. The contacts are always updated and secure. The offline library, the plans are available. They're updated, so you don't have an old version there. They always have the latest version. And if you're in the business of creating plans, you can always update at any stage, and everybody gets the latest update. You've got in-app messaging, which is, you know, the way that a lot of people work this day with WhatsApp, etc., and notifications. The difference is that in this environment, there is a record. Okay, everything you're doing within the Sentinel system is being logged. So when you have a post-incident review on that diagram I did with the 3 R's at the beginning, when you're talking about resilience, you can go back and say, oh, what did we do? How well did people respond? How fast did they respond? What were the conversations that were going in place? And this is important why it's in the same ecosystem, so you can do that analysis work. And you've got to have security. People talk a lot about a security culture. Our periphery of an organization now is hugely different than it was beforehand. You know, the boundaries, if you like, the fence around our organizations is now pushed out miles and miles apart. We're defending this fence. We're defending so many gates in the fence. And those gates are, in fact, you know, policed by people. So people say that people are our greatest weakness, but they're also our greatest strengths. Okay. So the security has to be company-wide. People have to think about security. So as the app has a reference library and you can put video in there, it's very effective training. For example, how to challenge an intruder that is in fact walking with a high-vis jacket, you don't know who they are. People get into buildings, people do key logging pens into pen drives into things to actually to get information about your special codes. All of these things cannot be done by the security team. It requires everybody to be vigilant, and you can use the app to develop over time a culture about the importance of security and particularly of data. So, and things like apps, you can use push notifications, which means that every week, if you wish to, you can push down and ask people a question. You can sort of ping them to say and give them a test by groups, not everybody, by groups. Keep it live. That's a very important lesson from apps, and we've built more than 1,000 apps around the world. So the one takeaway from that is, do not build an app and put it on people's devices and let it sit. You know, make sure that you're communicating to keep it live. And you can have things like a report button in there or a call button from the app. So people are at the heart of mitigating an attack. You need people to fix an incident, so therefore you need to communicate with them and find out whether they're safe or available to help, and that's the important part of having a broader approach than just particularly a small team. And the independent channel is in-app, SMS and email and voice, and all of these things give you resilience. Our SLA is that we will get information through to people inside 60 seconds. And to do that, you've got to have robust architecture. It's not sufficient to say, we're just going to have this SMS at sufficient capacity. Because, I mean, for example, in the attack in Brussels for the European Commission, it took 42 minutes for the SMSs to reach everybody. And the Nice attack, the government system in France had just failed to work, and it arrived hours later. So there's no point in having a system unless it's robust. So you need to have redundant architecture, which we've done with no single point of failure. The uptime has got to be very, very high. You've got to have data security. We built it with single tenant application with complete data separation for other clients. This is valuable data about your people. It's encrypted in transit, and you've got to, and the SMS capacity from our point of view is designed for every client. So we profile where are your offices. You've got offices in Dubai or in Hong Kong or in the UK, and we make sure that there is enough SMS numbers that we're going to use to do multiple broadcasts to you. Incident ready contacts. The key thing is making sure that everything's up to date. All these systems do not work unless the database is up to date, and we've got some very cool ways of doing that and very good ways of verifying people's data. And all of this has to be GDPR compliant. So people need to see what data is being held on them, and sometimes that data is sensitive. It may be the next of kin telephone number, for example. So all of that has got to be secure. The library, a plan in your hand when the incident strikes, and the groups and targeted messages are very, very important for these response teams. So we have a clear and present danger. It's pretty unprecedented times at the moment. We have got cyber attacks which are growing by about 23 or 24% per annum in terms of intensity and amount of damage. We've got an increasing risk of power outages due to hacking. We've always had extreme weather, but you know, it seems to me that with global warming, we're getting extreme weather popping up in places that we've never experienced beforehand. So those places are just not ready for it. We've got a real serious problem of supply chain failure because we're shipping stuff all the way across the globe from China, from everywhere else. And we've got this returning cohort of ISIS spreading themselves across various countries, like the tragic one in Indonesia, where the family returned from Syria and immediately blew themselves up in those Christian churches. And those are problems where the disenfranchised people who've lost the game are coming back into our society. That's going to be a continued problem. And of course, we have the old chestnut of fire, and hopefully we're getting better at managing fire, but we've got to do an awful lot better everywhere else. So, summary, resilience is not possible without effective and robust tools. The communication plans must exist, and you know, we find that companies got business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans, certainly, maybe business continuity plans, and communication plans often don't exist. Communication channels need to be independent and ready to go. The technology has to be robust and simple to use. Different groups need different communications, no point in blanket communications. And the apps are the ideal vehicles for communicating as a reference back for filling those memory blanks. So those things we forget. And that's a really important point when it comes to how to react in a crisis. So finally, just as we're coming up to the end of the thing on the hour mark, is that a little thing from Tesco and the importance of immediate communications. You remember the horse meat scandal? It broke that day and everybody was talking about it, but unfortunately nobody told the social media team. So that evening, a pre-programmed tweet went out, "It's sleepy time, so we're off to hit the hay." And you can imagine there was a big media storm. One little mistake there, and you can imagine how that won't run out. So we have to be very careful in this new world of ours, and we have to be very, very fast. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Please contact me. That's my email address there, rs@ud.com, or my telephone number there. And you can check out more details on the ud.com website. But this is a fascinating area. We're extremely passionate about it. And we've got some fantastic clients that are actually using our system at the moment, and they're very happy with the implementation. And also, more importantly, surprisingly enough, the users are delighted with it. So it's very important that not only do the management buy into it, but the actual users and the companies do as well. So I'm happy to take any questions, and I've got a little, as we're coming up to the hour mark, but thank you very much for listening. So I've got a few things of thanks, but no immediate questions, but I'm going to keep the line open if anybody wants to over the next few minutes, but thank you very much for visiting. Thanks, Alberto, for your thanks for this webinar. I'm pleased that you appreciate it. Okay, with no further questions, then I am going to be leaving the webinar. Thank you very much.